Hello, everybody. I am Sonia Serino, a professor at the Linguistics Department at the University of Campinas, and I am also a visiting professor at the Federal University of Bahia at this moment. I'm very happy to moderate today's talk in the Abralim ao Vivo series. As you know, the coronavirus pandemic has reshaped many of our academic activities, and since social distance was and still is an important necessary measure. However, the exchange of ideas within the linguistic community has to be maintained. With this in mind, the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralim, in cooperation with several international associations such as the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, the Asociação de Linguística e Filologia de la América Latina, the Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Linguísticos, the Association Internationale de Linguistique Appliquée, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Societas Linguística Europaea, Australian Linguistic Society, British Association for Applied Linguistics, and the Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística organized a virtual event, Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online. The event had, during the critical period of the pandemics, a daily schedule of lectures and panel sessions with distinguished linguists from all over the world and from all subdisciplines. Now, due to the huge success, the event became a regular series. The purpose of the series Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online, is to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on the most diverse topics related to the study of human language. All the activities are broadcast online here and open, which is an open and interactive platform. The broadcasts are freely available for later access as well. Now, today, our invited speaker is Dr. Michelle Yuan. Professor Michelle Yuan received her BA and MA, Masters of Arts in Linguistics, from the University of Toronto, and her PhD in Linguistics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Now, her main areas of research are in syntax and its interface, and she's broadly interested in questions pertaining to cross-linguistic variation and language universals. She has investigated topics in case and agreement, ergativity, syntactic movement, and polysynthetic wordhood. She specializes in the grammatical structure of the Inuit dialect continuum, with a particular focus on the varieties spoken in Eastern Canada. Her talk today is about the syntax of incorporation in Inuktitut, with the title Covert, a Movement and a Syntax Morphology Interface, Insights from Inuktitut Incorporation. We thank Dr. Yuan for having accepted our invitation to collaborate in the Abralim ao Vivo Linguistics Online series. And I remind the participants that questions can be asked through the YouTube chat. At the end of the talk, I will pass them on to Dr. Yuan. I now give the floor to our invited speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the warm invitation and introduction. Let me just share my screen now. So hopefully you can see it. Okay. So if you can see my screen, I will go ahead and get started. One moment, actually. Okay, there you go. Okay, well, thank you again for the invitation. Today's talk, as Dr. Serino said, is on covert aid movement and what Inuktitut Incorporation can bear on that. So just to first introduce the notion of covert movement, well, I'm going to be working within the copy theory of movement, a theory in which movement chains consist of identical copies of a syntactic object. So under this theory, one way in which we can frame the distinction between overt movement and covert movement would be simply in terms of which copies are spelled out and which copies are deleted in the post-syntactic component of the grammar. So for instance, as schematized in 1A versus 1B, overt movement could simply be spelling out the topmost copy and deletion of lower copies, whereas covert movement could be the converse, that is the spell out of the lowest movement copy, but deletion of higher copies. So in other words, in covert movement, there is movement taking place in the syntax, but this may be potentially obscured based on which copies are actually being pronounced. So in light of this notion, there is a surprising asymmetry, namely that there are actually very few clear cases of covert A movement that have been attested cross-linguistically. And this is especially in contrast to both overt A movement and covert A bar movement, both of which are more commonly found. So I have here actually a quote from a recent paper by Polinsky and Potsdam on covert A movement, where they say, in the domain of A-bar movement, analyses appealing to covert analogs of most overt phenomena are easy to find. For A movement, the picture is rather different. Overt A movement phenomena are robustly attested cross-linguistically. However, clear cases of covert analogs are exceedingly rare. So in this talk, I will try to offer a pathway to identify more cases of covert A movement. And in particular, I want to extend recent research that has been done on the A-bar domain to the A domain. And specifically, there has been much work in A-bar movement that has shown that spell-out patterns in A-bar movement can in fact be regulated by conditions on morphological well-formedness in a way that I will specify shortly. And what I want to argue is that in the right context, this exact logic can also be shown to trigger lowest copy spell-out within an A chain, thereby revealing a movement that is covert as well. And here's an initial illustration from the A-bar domain from Coptic. So in a series of papers by Reintges, including Reintges 2007, which is cited here, in Coptic, there is both overt WH movement and also WH in situ, but crucially, whether you get one or the other can be determined by what he refers to as kind of like a morphological doubly filled comp filter, just like in English. So the notion here is that if you have something in spec CP and also something overt in C as well, only one of the two can be pronounced. And this can regulate whether WH movement seems to be overt or covert in Coptic. So as illustrated in 2A, for example, here we have overt WH movement. So from where is at the left periphery of the clause, whereas in 2B, the same WH phrase is in C2. And what's crucial here is that the in C2 pattern co-occurs with an overt complementizer, which is bolded in 2B here on the verb. And what Reintges argues is that this alternation only follows if the WH and C2 construction actually involves syntactic movement to spec CP in the first place, because you have to have something in spec CP in order for the doubly filled comp filter to apply. That is, you have to have something in C and in spec CP. In contrast, under a no movement approach to WH and C2, you would not really get this generalization to emerge. So the idea here then is that deletion of the topmost copy due to the C being overt, like in 2B, allows the lowest copy to be pronounced instead, resulting in covert A-bar movement. So what I want to do in this talk is extend this basic idea to A movement. And I'll present here a case study from Inuktitut, which refers to the Eastern Canadian varieties of the Inuit dialect continuum. And due to its polysynthetic nature, Inuktitut provides a unique lens into possible interactions between syntactic movement and complex word formation. Specifically, I'll show that Inuktitut has productive incorporation processes, which target nominal objects and in certain configuration complement clauses as well. And generally, incorporation in the language takes place in order to satisfy certain morphological requirements of what are called affixal verbs in the language. So the central observation of this talk then is that incorporated objects in Inuktitut behave as though they are in fact syntactically active and therefore can also undergo a movement despite obligatorily surfacing within the verb complex. So this really just instantiates the same interaction that we saw in Coptic a few slides ago, but the relevant morphological constraint is essentially a stray affix filter. So that's the idea that when you have an affix, the host of the affix has to be overtly pronounced. And in this case, in Inuktitut, this filter is imposed by the incorporating verb, which, as I mentioned earlier, is affixal. So the idea is that if there is some syntactic element, let's call it XP, that undergoes movement, and some copy of XP happens to serve as the host for bound morphology, like the affix, then that copy has to be pronounced as schematized in 3. So beyond a movement, the findings of this talk also further our understanding of Inuit clause structure, which I think is overall still rather limited. And in particular, I think illuminates how the clausal syntax of Inuit interacts with complex word formation. And in particular, what we'll see throughout this talk is that many of the familiar hallmarks of hierarchical structure are detectable in Inuktitut and in Inuit overall, even if this is not necessarily obvious based on word order and other kinds of more canonical diagnostics of hierarchical structure. And on the flip side, this talk also illustrates the utility of morphologically complex languages in terms of the kinds of insights they can bring into clausal syntax. So to take you through the rest of this talk, first I'll provide an overview of some basic morphosyntactic properties of Inuktitut that we need to know for the rest of this talk. Then I will discuss incorporation, and in particular, I want to establish that objects that get incorporated are not structurally reduced, which is kind of contrary to the more cross-linguistically common picture of incorporation. Then I'll turn to 2 cases of covert A movement from passivization and object shift respectively. And finally, I'll extend the basic idea from this talk to another domain, namely backward control. Okay, so the Inuit dialect continuum is from the Inuit Yupik-Unangan language family, and it's spoken across the North American Arctic and in Greenland. And throughout this talk, all the uncited examples are in Inuktitut, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the Eastern Canadian varieties of Inuit, spoken around Nunavut here. If you can see my cursor, I'm circling it right now. But the findings are expected to hold for Inuit as a whole. So most of the examples in this talk that are uncited were elicited in Iqaluit Nunavut, which is right here, if you can see my cursor. If you can't, it's the southern tip of Baffin Island. In 2017 anyway, is when these were elicited. And supplementary data were elicited remotely or online in 2018, 2019. So the speakers whose varieties of Inuktitut are represented in this talk hail from various communities around Baffin Island. Inuktitut, like most other Inuit Yupik-Unangan languages, displays what's called an ergative case patterning, as shown in 4a versus 4b. So in 4a, for example, here we have an intransitive subject, miali, which is absolutive. And in 4b, we see that the case of miali is the same case as of the object window here, absolutive. In contrast, the transitive subject, David, has a distinct case, which is called ergative. And notice here that both ergative and absolutive nominals can be indexed by verbal agreement morphology. So in 4a, that's just the absolutive subject, whereas in 4b, we have both the subject and the object being indexed by the agreement. So that's the basic ergative case and agreement patterning in the language. And in contrast, this alternates with what's called an antipassive or non-ergative case patterning. So now comparing 4b with 4c, 4b we had just seen in the previous slide. In 4c, the logically transitive subject David is not ergative anymore, but here it's actually absolutive. Window, the object, is not absolutive, but rather it takes this other morphology mic, which is glossed as MOD, which stands for modalis. That's the name of this case morphology that's used in Inuit. And note here that only the subject, the absolutive subject in 4c, is indexed by agreement. And that's because only ergative and absolutive nominals can be cross-referenced by agreement in the language. Inuktitut, like the other Inuit varieties, is polysynthetic or highly agglutinating, and it has relatively flexible word order, although base SOV. Verb complexes in the language are invariably composed of an initial root, followed by various derivational and inflectional suffixes, and then ending with mood and agreement morphology. So this is shown in 5a and 5b. In 5a, the root here is the verb open. Here we have an affixal adverb early, and then tense, and then the mood and agreement cluster at the right edge. The order of morphemes within a word adheres to the mirror principle. So we can assume that as you move rightwards within a given word, we're actually going higher in the syntactic structure. And this is suggestive of a right-headed structure. So all my trees in this talk will be right-headed as well. So note that for our purposes, then, agreement is actually in the CP domain, though this won't figure too heavily into this talk. In incorporation, the leftmost morpheme in the verb complex is actually going to be the incorporated element. So for example, the incorporated noun, and that would be adjacent to the verb. And throughout this talk, just to make it easier to find all the morphemes, the incorporating verb is underlined. So in 6, for example, the verb make is underlined here because it's incorporating. And incorporation in the language can be diagnosed by the lack of inflectional morphology on the noun, as well as certain phonological processes that apply at morpheme boundaries but which don't apply across words. In 6, for example, necklace as a standalone word actually is uyamik with the final K, but notice that this K is missing when it's incorporated. In addition, in 6, the interpretation here of the object is actually ambiguous between singular and plural, and notice that there is no plural morphology on the incorporated object. There's also no case morphology, as we'll discuss later on. Cross-linguistically, noun incorporation tends to be optional and permitted with a variety of transitive and sometimes even unaccusative verbs. So in the Mohawk examples in 7, for instance, in 7a, we have the standalone object bed, and in 7b, we see that bed can also be incorporated into the verb complex. So this is kind of the more canonical picture cross-linguistically. Incorporated nouns across languages tend to be non-specific or perhaps narrow scope and so on. And therefore, it's most often assumed that incorporated nouns are structurally reduced in some way relative to their non-incorporated counterparts, and perhaps even non-argumental compared to their non-incorporated counterparts as well. In contrast, in Inuit, incorporation is actually going to be obligatory with a small set of verbs. And then for all other verbs, incorporation is not possible. So we can see this by comparing the incorporating verb tulk, which is glossed here as consume, versus a seemingly similar verb eat nili, as in 8b. So notice that in 8a, consume is obligatorily incorporating. So it's not possible to have a separate noun that has not been incorporated, as indicated by the presence of case morphology in 8a. In contrast, in 8b, we see the opposite, namely that a verb that, like eat, nili, cannot incorporate a noun. So therefore, one way to really just view this contrast is to say that there are some verbs that are affixal and there are other verbs that are not affixal. The affixal verbs have to attach to some sort of root, whereas non-affixal verbs contain roots to begin with and they're not incorporating. Now, you may be wondering how we know whether a verb is affixal or not, and there is actually a pattern to this. So affixal verbs are, as a class, semantically underspecified compared to non-affixal verbs. So in work by Johns, 2007, also in some other work as well by Johns, affixal verbs are going to be taken as light verbs, that is of category little v, whereas non-affixal verbs contain roots and they're going to be lexical verbs. And this is an assumption that I follow here. So an interesting kind of pattern here is that if you look at the range of verbs that do incorporate, that is, are affixal, they do tend to be semantically bleached compared to the verbs that don't incorporate. So for example, throughout 9, we see that the kinds of verbs that are incorporating are things like to consume, to be, to have, to make, to lack, and so on. So with the basic picture of incorporation in place, let's now turn to the morphosyntactic properties of incorporated elements in Inuktitut. So in particular, I'll be showing that incorporated nouns are not structurally reduced against kind of the cross-linguistically more typical picture of incorporated nouns. So as I said, most approaches to incorporation cross-linguistically take objects to be structurally reduced. And this is true for most previous work on Inuit incorporation as well. So for example, in previous work, The object that's been incorporated has been analyzed as a bare N head, or perhaps a bare root, or an NP as opposed to a DP. And this is in line with the typical cross-linguistic picture. For Inuit, this accounts for the commonly observed non-specific interpretation of incorporated objects. Also, the lack of inflectional morphology on the incorporated noun, like number morphology or case morphology, and also the overall intransitive morphosyntax of the sentence. So in 10a, for example, I had mentioned this earlier, but note the lack of number morphology when the noun has been incorporated, even though a plural interpretation could be in principle permitted when the noun has been incorporated. So in 10a, I made a house or I made houses are both possible interpretations of this sentence. In 10b, note also the lack of case morphology, even though the adjective here that's big, that modifies the incorporated object does display the modalist case morphology. And I did not show this here, but if there were an overt subject in 10a or 10b, it would be absolutive. So this just looks kind of like the anti-passive construction that I introduced a few slides ago. That being said, I will demonstrate throughout this talk that incorporated elements, and at least in Inuktitut, perhaps not necessarily throughout Inuit, but at least in Inuktitut, do not differ semantically or syntactically from their non-incorporated, that is, standalone counterparts. So given that there is this loss of inflectional morphology, this must be due to a morphological constraint, which I won't necessarily get into too much. But I guess what's really crucial here is that it does not necessarily reflect a structural distinction. And as a reminder of kind of the point of this talk, I want to use incorporation as a means to further understand a movement, but this is not possible unless we first establish that incorporated nouns are not structurally deficient, rather they're argumental and they can be accessed by various kinds of syntactic operations like movement. So first, incorporated nouns are not bare heads, nor are they bare roots. They can, in fact, be structurally complex. So, for example, modified by adjectives and other kinds of suffixes, including adjectival affixes too. So this is shown throughout 11a and 11b, respectively. In 11a, the constituent that's been incorporated is something like something that can be eaten. So here we have a nominalizer, tsiak. We also have a participle and then a verb. In 11b, here we have a pretend great house. So this whole modified noun has been incorporated into the verb. And again, these examples suggest that whatever is being incorporated cannot simply be a bare N head, nor can it be a bare root. Second, incorporated nouns are DPs, I think, because proper names, pronouns, and in some cases, possesses that bear possessive morphology can all undergo incorporation. So in 12a, we have a proper noun undergoing an incorporation. This is miali. So the sentence here is palupiluk, that is a sea monster, going to eat miali. Miali, by the way, is still interpreted here as referential, even though it's been incorporated. In 12b, we have a pronoun undergoing incorporation. That's the first person singular pronoun me or I, uvanga. And in 12c, we have Carol resembles her elder relatives, and what's being incorporated here is her elders. So her is encoded by the possessive agreement that's on the noun. Oops. And beyond incorporation of nouns, affixal verbs can also incorporate constituents that are verbal or even clausal. So this is shown throughout 13. In 13a, we have what looks like a VP being incorporated, so into perhaps a control verb. So I'm trying to fix Johnny's car. Fix is incorporated into the verb try. In 13b, we have a TP being incorporated. So here we have a verb shatter, we have passive morphology, and then we have tense morphology, and all of this is being incorporated into the verb say, nirak. In 13c, we have tense morphology, pao, same tense as in 13b, plus a verb stem, plus what I've glossed here as participial mood. So I'll show you later on in this talk that here we actually have a whole CP that's being incorporated too. So overall then, in Inuit, incorporation is really a subtype of a broader pattern of complex word formation, and it seems like the relevant verbs that are all happen to be affixal, they simply differ in the kinds of constituents that they select for. So whether it's a nominal constituent or a non-nominal constituent. And recall that incorporation in Inuit takes place in order to satisfy the affixal property of certain verbs, and that's why it's obligatory for these kinds of verbs. An assumption that I'll make throughout this talk then is that incorporation is simply derived post-syntactically. It's really just the affixation of the verb to its complement, whatever its complement is, whether it's a noun or a VP or a TP or a CP, really. But if all of this is true, then whether incorporation takes place should be independent of any processes that take place in the syntax proper. That is, if incorporation is post-syntactic, that is, it takes place in a different module as the syntax, after the syntax has applied, it should not matter what happens in the syntax, including whether whatever is being incorporated undergoes movement first or not. So, coupled with the copy theory of movement, which I introduced at the beginning of this talk, this treatment of incorporation, I think, yields certain expectations, which I will argue are in fact borne out. Due to the morphological requirements of the affixal verb, the incorporated object, that is, its host, should be obligatorily pronounced, and that's basically the stray affix filter. If the complement of an affixal verb happens to undergo syntactic movement in the syntactic component of the grammar, subsequent incorporation should therefore trigger spell out of the lowest copy. That is the copy that happens to serve as the host for incorporation. And higher copies of movement may or perhaps must be deleted in accordance with principles of economy. So for example, pronounce only what you need to. So this is all schematized in 14. And notice that here is really how we're going to find cases of covert A movement by forcing the lowest copy to be pronounced because of incorporation. And note, just kind of as a schematization related aspect of this talk is that the kind of bracketing that I have in 14 is my very simplified way of encoding affixation. So you'll see that in the other trees as well. Okay, so now let's turn to two cases of covert A movement, which again is going to be A movement in the syntax followed by incorporation of the lowest movement copy. And note that the typical indicators of movement that you might expect to see cross-linguistically, like differences in word order, are not really going to be available here. The evidence for movement, that is whether movement takes place or not, is going to come instead from the syntactic and semantic properties of the relevant constructions that we are interested in. So our point of departure is actually an observation made in Johns 2009, in which it's noted that incorporation constructions in Inuktitut can actually contain passive morphology, and this is shown throughout 15. In 15a, we have this incorporated constituent former caribou or caribou meat, which has been incorporated into the verb consume. And then there's passive morphology, and this gets interpreted as a passive. So the caribou meat is being eaten. And in 15b as well, the necklace is being made. Similarly, here we have passive morphology in this verb complex. Now, note that while these data are provided in this paper by Johns, there's no analysis provided. And also this observation does not figure into any other work in Inuit noun incorporation to my knowledge. My proposal is that this construction truly does seem to involve a movement of the incorporated nominal, that is the internal argument, to a canonical subject position. So to show this, let's first overview some properties of Inuit passives. These are all pretty typical properties that you also find cross-linguistically. So first of all, the passivized nominal, because it's been promoted to subject, it can be cross-referenced by subject agreement. Second, the agent is optional, and when it is present, it's marked with an oblique case, so it's a bit like a bipassive in English. And most importantly for our purposes, passivization creates new antecedents for anaphor binding, and this is indicative of a movement. So all of these are shown in 16b, which is kind of a passive sentence that follows the context given in 16a. So in 16a, we have this active sentence, only my parents scolded me. 16b, the others were not scolded by their parents. So here, the others is the internal argument of scold, right? It's absolutive because it's been passivized. There's also passive morphology in the verb complex, so scold has been passivized. There's also third person plural agreement on the verb, and this is presumably targeting the others. And as I said earlier, the others can also bind a lower anaphor. In this case, the anaphor is encoded by the reflexive possessive agreement on the optional agent. So that's by their parents. That's the me suffix here. So here it looks as though because we've undergone movement, or because we've had the internal argument undergo movement, specifically a movement, it's able to bind the anaphor within the biphrase. And what's crucial now is that these same properties are also present in incorporation contexts, which would suggest a uniform analysis. So first of all, in 17b, which is the plural analog of 17a, we see that the incorporated noun can indeed be cross-referenced by subject agreement. So here in 17b, the necklaces are being made. Notice that because we have this plural interpretation of the necklace, even though there's no plural morphology on the noun itself, we have plural agreement on the verb. And more tellingly, the incorporated noun can even bind a lower anaphor within the biphrase. So in 18a, we have an active sentence, the animal ate a spider. So spider has been incorporated into consume. In 18b, now we have passive morphology on within the verb complex. And here the spider, even though it is realized within the verb complex, can still bind, crucially, an anaphor within the biphrase. So this sentence is interpreted as the spider is being eaten by its mate, where it is the anaphor. And this is kind of like meant to be like a Black Widow context, if you're wondering why this would be uttered. But the point here is that this binding pattern also shows that the passive incorporation construction cannot be analyzed as something like an impersonal with the incorporated noun remaining in situ. Rather, it has to have undergone movement to some position, C commanding the position of the biphrase. So together, as I said, these facts show that there is indeed a movement to subject position in incorporation constructions, despite the surface realization of the noun within the verb complex. So this is schematized very simply in 19. So again, there's movement. Let's assume it's just spec TP. However, because the verb happens to be affixal, it's going to force incorporation, that is spell out of the lowest copy. And then the higher one will be deleted. So this results in the appearance of covert A movement. So let's now turn to a second case of this kind of interaction, now from object shift. So in addition to passive morphology, Johns 2009 and also Beach 2011 observed that incorporated nominals in Inuktitut can also be cross-referenced by object agreement. This is shown throughout 20A and 20B. So in both of these examples, here we have agreement that targets a null first person, presumably ergative subject, that's the I here, and also third person singular agreement, presumably with what's being incorporated, the third person singular incorporated object. Now, again, these facts are left unanalyzed by both authors, and they don't appear in other literature on Inuit incorporation. And it's also possible, as I say in footnote 15, that these facts are specific to Inuktitut, not clear so far. Now, crucially, what I want to now show is, once again, there really seems to be a syntactic basis for this kind of alternation. What I want to show is that incorporated objects can be targeted by agreement, but this is really actually part of a larger pattern, specifically that noun incorporation constructions in Inuktitut, in fact, alternate between ergative and antipassive, that is non-ergative patternings. So in other words, the constructions that we saw in 20 are really just ergative constructions containing an incorporated object. So let's consider the data in 21, which now have an overt subject and also now have potentially an incorporated object being plural. right? So in 21A, we have kind of the baseline intransitive example where David, the transitive subject, or I guess the logically transitive subject, is absolutive. There's only subject agreement on the verb, and the noun has been incorporated. In 21B, however, we see that David is actually ergative, and now there's object agreement on the verb, presumably presumably indexing cookie or biscuit. There's also an interpretive distinction between these two examples, which I'll revisit shortly. But the point here is that when we have object agreement on the verb, this actually looks like an ergative construction. And more broadly, I want to highlight that these data demonstrate that incorporation constructions are not necessarily intransitive. So I have argued elsewhere that ergative case in Inuit is dependent in the sense of Morantz and Baker and others. If this is correct, then the incorporated object must figure into the dependent case algorithm somehow. That is, it seems to be syntactically active for the purposes of case assignment. This is actually quite different from the more cross-linguistically common picture, in which object incorporation tends to bleed ergative case assignment to the subject. So in 22A and B, for example, from Chukchi, we see that when an object gets incorporated into the verb, here that's butter in 22B, incorporated into the verb spread on something, that tends to result in the ergative case that would normally be assigned to a transitive subject disappearing. So that's why in 22B, the subject is absolutive, not ergative. But we had just seen in Inuktitut that that's not the case. So I mentioned earlier that the two constructions, the two incorporation constructions happen to have somewhat different semantics, and this is what I want to turn to next. This is repeated in this slide here, 21A and 21B. So in 21A, this can be translated as something like David wants to eat the cookies or eat cookies. In 21B, notice that this gets most naturally translated as something like David wants to eat these cookies. So cookies is actually kind of more referential somehow, or more specific when it's incorporated inside an ergative incorporation construction. So my proposal is that this difference is fundamentally about object shift, specifically whether the object stays in C2, as in 21A, versus whether it moves to a structurally higher position, like in 21B, which would be consistent with its kind of more specific interpretation. So, in fact, the idea that movement of the object takes place to derive an ergative construction is kind of the received analysis across Inuit in terms of the contrast between antipassive and ergative constructions. The received analysis is, in fact, that modalis objects of antipassive constructions are VP internal, that is, they're in C2, like schematized in 23A, whereas absolutive objects are raised, that is VP external. Now notice that in 23B, the object actually moves to a higher position than the ergative subject. You can see footnote 19 about that in this slide, but it won't actually figure into this talk at all otherwise, so you can feel free to ignore that. What's most important here is that absolutive objects are higher than their modalis counterparts. And note that the high position of absolutive objects is coextensive with the occurrence of phi agreement with that object. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it can also trigger dependent ergative case assignment to the subject. And these are actually all these are all properties of the A domain, right? So agreement and case are both kind of A properties. So this might suggest that whatever kind of movement this is that takes place to derive an ergative construction, this movement is some sort of A movement as well. And this movement step, as I said, explains a number of well-known contrasts between modalis and absolutive objects, including the interpretation of these kinds of objects. So notably, in contrast to modalis objects, absolutive objects must be interpreted as specific or wide scope. And this has been documented and discussed at length by Bittner, for example. So here are some examples from Bittner, from Inuktitut or West Greenlandic. In 24a, we have an anti-passive construction where the transitive subject is absolutive and the object is modalis. And notice that here there's also negation on the verb. And importantly, the interpretation of this sentence in 24a is one where negation scopes over the object one book. So this is translated as Yuna hasn't received even one book yet. In contrast, in 24b, in which we have an ergative construction featuring an absolutive object, this object now scopes above negation. So it seems to be specific or wide scope. So the translation here is there is a particular book that Yuna hasn't received yet. And this is consistent with the object movement analysis if it's moving into a domain of specificity, for example. Now, what's important for our purposes is that if we turn back to incorporation, we see that this kind of contrast is also found in incorporation contexts as well. Specifically, if the incorporated object is cross-referenced by object agreement, and if it co-occurs with an ergative subject, that is, if it is in an ergative construction, then it too must be interpreted as wide scope or specific. So we had already seen that a few slides ago, but here is another set of examples now with a modal and with negation, so we can really see the scopal properties a bit more clearly. The contexts provided in 25a and 25b, by the way, were actually provided by the particular Inuktitut speaker that produced these sentences to kind of clarify when she would utter 25a versus 25b. So in 25a, for example, the context that was provided was that Uluk has a seafood allergy. And for that reason, you can say, felicitously, Uluk can't or won't eat any fish. So here, fish is taking narrow scope under the modal and also under negation. That's wunna and neat, respectively, on the verb. In 25b, however, here the context is that Uluk won't eat salmon if there's Arctic char around. So there's a particular fish that Uluk won't eat in 25b. So here, fish is actually being interpreted as specific relative to negation into the modal. So the object in 25b is incorporated, but semantically, it behaves on par with standalone absolutive objects, and it also does so syntactically too, like the fact that it can co-occur with agreement and trigger dependent ergative case assignment to the subject. And that would suggest a uniform analysis with the non-incorporated absolutive objects too. That is, it too has undergone object shift. So therefore, incorporation constructions in Inuktitut display the same anti-passive and ergative alternations that we had seen in non-incorporating contexts, suggesting a common analysis. So covert object shift of a noun that's been incorporated can be detected by object agreement, ergative case on the subject, and the wide scope or specific interpretation of the object. So just to summarize what I've shown you so far, broadly, I've shown you that incorporated nouns in Inuktitut are not structurally reduced, rather they seem to be syntactically active, and they can even undergo various kinds of A movements, such as passivization and object shift. But because they must be realized within the verb complex due to the affixal nature of the verb in question, this occurrence of A movement is covert. So more broadly, though, I think beyond simply discussing incorporation and A movement, I think that these patterns are they're cool because they illustrate how morphological considerations can provide a window into the syntax. So in the last aspect of this talk, I want to extend the basic interaction that I had just shown you to another domain, specifically backward control. So many languages have been shown, especially recently, to display backward control, and that's when the lower element of a control construction is morphologically overt, whereas the presumably present higher element is not overt. And this can alternate in some languages with the better studied cases of forward control, for which a pro-analysis is more standard. So in the Bantu language Ndebele, for instance, there's forward control and there's backward control, as discussed in a recent paper by Asha Petrashko. So in 26a, for example, this is the forward control construction. Zodwa tried to cook. Zodwa occurs preceding the matrix verb try. In 26b, however, this is the backward control pattern where this means also Zod will try to cook, but now the controllee is realized inside of the embedded verb, and there's nothing overtly pronounced in the matrix verb. So note that while forward control can very easily be analyzed in terms of pro, like a null pro in the embedded clause, which is kind of the standard analysis, backward control presents a challenge to this because what's actually in the embedded clause seems to be a morphologically overt element. So backward control patterns, when they were kind of originally discovered by Polinsky and Potsdam, they were leveraged for movement-based theories of control, following, for example, Hornstein's work on movement as control as movement, sorry. However, non-movement analyses are also available. So here I've listed just kind of 3 possible analyses of backward control. These are not the only ones, but these are 3 possible ones. So first, there's the idea that there's covert A movement. So there's movement from the embedded clause to the matrix clause, followed by obligatory lowest copy spellout, resulting in the appearance of backward control. And there are also some no movement analyses as well of backward control. So for instance, in the Petrashko paper that I mentioned earlier, she argues that backward control actually involves basically agreement with an index feature of the noun that's in situ, so it hasn't moved at all in the syntax. And in some work by Alexiadou and Enignostopoulos, they have a phi agreement analysis with an in situ nominal as well. So this again does not involve movement. So what I'll show now is that incorporation in Inuktitut can also be used to reveal, in the right contexts, a backward control configuration. And moreover, I want to suggest that the exact nature of the kind of construction we're interested in is amenable to a covert hyperraising analysis, that is covert A movement out of a CP, though I think more work is needed to really show that this is the case. So I'm being a little tentative here still. But the exact range of facts is a bit difficult to capture under existing no movement analyses to backward control. So the basis of this construction is a rather under-described kind of clause incorporating construction that's used to express existentials. And I first introduced this earlier in this talk in 13C, which I've repeated here in this slide. So in this construction, we have an existential verb, hak, that's have. And in my recent work on this, I've argued that it embeds essentially a small clause consisting of the subject, which is the nominal pivot of the existential, and then also a CP predicate, which is what's been incorporated. So this construction can get translated as an existential, like there arrived a woman earlier today, or a woman arrived earlier today, where a woman is the nominal pivot, and then the arriving earlier part is what's been incorporated into the verb, morphologically speaking. Feel free to ask me about details of this analysis if it's not so clear. So as I said, the small clause predicate seems to be a CP. Okay, so it can bear tense morphology, like shown in 27a. That's the recent past morphological here. It can also bear negation, which is shown in 27b, and also it can bear mood morphology that's used to express declarative clauses. So that's the yuk or tuk that's found in the incorporated constituent, which note in these examples actually matches morphologically the agreement in 27a and 27b as well. Okay, and I had mentioned earlier that agreement is in the CP domain, and it tends to be kind of clustered with mood. So this shows that these kinds of incorporated constituents also contain mood, which is why I think that they're CPs. So here's a highly simplified structure of clause incorporation in Inuktitut. The idea is that syntactically, the verb embeds, that is, takes as its complement a small clause, but morphologically speaking, it's going to glom onto the C of the predicate. And then C is going to also be an affix, so it's going to attach to T and so on. So the proposal that I have in my other work is that this small clause is actually basically a pseudo-relative construction. That is a small clause that morphologically resembles a relative clause and its head, but is crucially structurally distinct from a relative clause. And the pseudo-relative CP cross-linguistically is often analyzed as containing a gap that's related to the nominal subject in terms of control. So the idea would be that in an example like 29, which illustrates a pseudo-relative in Italian, the empty category inside of the CP is actually going to be essentially a variable that's bound by the overt noun, and these are related in terms of control. So note that while pseudo-relatives have most often been discussed in terms of complements of perception verbs, like in Italian in 29 here, in Inuktitut, I argue in my other work that the same kind of syntax is found, but in a different kind of configuration. So in this kind of existential context instead. So there are several pieces of evidence that pseudo-relatives cross-linguistically involve control. And one important one for our purposes is really that the clause external noun has to be construed as the subject of the embedded clause. And this subject-only gap restriction is in line with the assumed control analysis, because typically we think that only embedded subjects can be controlled. So this kind of contrast is shown in 30A versus 30B. So in 30A, we see that it's possible to use a pseudo-relative to say, I saw Luigi greet Maria, where the gap is in the embedded subject position, but it's not possible to say something like, I saw Luigi that Maria greeted, using a pseudo-relative construction. Now, crucially, this subject gap restriction is also found in the Inuktitut clause incorporation construction. And as I say in footnote 26, there are some other ways in which this kind of construction behaves like pseudo-relatives, which I haven't shown here, but you can feel free to ask me about that later if you're interested. But for now, let's focus on the contrast in 31A through C versus in 31D. So in 31A, B, and C, we have various instances of subject gaps, specifically intransitive subject gaps. So in 31A, we have just kind of a regular unaccusative verb, arrive. And then notice that here, the overt nominal woman is interpreted as the subject of arrive. It's fine. In 31B, here we actually have an anti-passive construction. So this is a daughter hugged her mother, or, not so grammatically in English, they're hugged a daughter, her mother, or something like that. Here we have a daughter, which is the nominal pivot of the existential, and it's interpreted as the anti-passive subject of hug. Here you can even bind, by the way, the object of the anti-passive too. In 31C, here we have a passive that's been incorporated into the existential verb. So this is like a window was broken, or there was broken a window, something like that. So window is the passivized subject. And in 31D, here's an attempt of many attempts not shown here, but here's one instance of an attempt to form a non-subject gap in this kind of construction. So there is a cookie eaten or something like that. And this crucially just isn't possible to encode at all. So therefore, I want to conclude that the clause incorporating construction involves subject control, which is in line with this kind of the canonical pseudo-relative analysis. And what's important here is the fact that I had shown you earlier that the gap can encode a passivized subject, and this is repeated in 31C here. This is important because this is the syntactic configuration that we need to show backward control is possible, because we had already seen earlier in this talk that you can incorporate a passivized nominal into the embedded verb, thereby resulting in lowest copy spell out. So now let's try to do that in the pseudo-relative existential construction as well. In fact, we can do this, and here we have the emergence of backward control. So in the construction in 32, the pseudo-relative subject is morphologically realized within the embedded verb complex, because all we did was make the embedded verb an affixal verb. So here we actually have recursive incorporations. This is a rather long sequence, so I'll break it down for you in the next few slides. But the idea here is that we've basically embedded a nominal within the embedded verb here, which happens to be incorporating. We passivize that, and then the whole clause has been incorporated into the existential verb have. Okay, and I also want to point out the interpretation of this sentence, of this whole sequence, which was something like, there was a cookie not eaten. It does not mean that no cookies were eaten. It means that there is a particular cookie that has not been eaten, and this is indicated by the speaker's comment pertaining to this sentence that one was left over. So the passivized nominal is taking wide scope relative to CP internal negation, which I've boxed here in this example, suggesting that it has in fact moved to subject position above negation. Okay, so here we have movement, presumably, or at least backward control, consisting of a higher element, even though it's been, even though the noun is being realized within the embedded verb. So let's deconstruct this example since I know it's kind of complicated. So first, the embedded verb took or consume, that's the little v here in this tree, takes a nominal complement, for example, cookie. And because there's passivization happening, the noun moves to the embedded subject position. So let's say that's spec TP. Next, the entire clause is the predicate of the small clause, okay, whose subject controls the passivized nominal. Now here, I'm being very neutral in terms of my analysis of control. So all I have here are two different DPs, but they're co-indexed, okay? And the entire small clause is embedded under the matrix existential verb or have, which would be this little v here up top. And the nominal complement of the embedded verb is obligatorily pronounced because that verb is affixal, and the nominals that are identical to it are deleted for typical economy purposes, resulting in the sequence that we had earlier in 32. So now let's ask how to derive this pattern. So how are the controller and the controllee, that is the small clause subject, and the passivized embedded subject actually linked? Now, I think that by process of elimination, the A movement analysis of backward control seems to be most compatible with the data. Under a covert A movement analysis, we do have to say that there is movement out of a CP, out of the incorporated pseudorelative CP, but we know that there is hyperraising cross-linguistically, so perhaps we could say that there is hyperraising here as well. In contrast, no movement analyses, such as the phi agreement analysis or the index agreement analysis from earlier, I think that they actually miss an insight, namely that backward control in Inuktitut is governed by the same factors that trigger lowest copy spellout in movement contexts. That is, you only ever get the backward control pattern if you actually have a morphological requirement to spell out the lowest copy. And I also want to point out that there is some precedent to this, the idea that there is hyperraising out of pseudorelative CPs. I found a paper by Herbeck 2020 on Spanish that basically argues for this, so perhaps this can be extended here. So what's unusual about the Inuktitut data, though, if this analysis is correct, is that hyperraising is covert. I think nonetheless, even if this is ultimately incorrect, I want to point out that I think that this preceding discussion does demonstrate the exploratory potential of the basic interaction theory seen throughout this talk to areas beyond straightforward cases of a movement. So I want to just really quickly summarize and then end here so we have time for questions, which is recent work within the A-bar domain has shown that the pronunciation of movement chains can in part be regulated by certain kinds of conditions on morphological well-formedness. And incorporation in Inuktitut shows that this general interaction also exists in the domain of a movement. Specifically, it can provide novel evidence for the existence of covert A movement. So in this talk, I've shown that in these incorporating contexts in Inuktitut, that syntactic movement of the incorporated noun truly has taken place. However, the morphological requirements of the affixal verb forces the nominal that's been incorporated to be realized within the verb complex. And beyond movement, this interaction can be useful for probing other kinds of syntactic phenomena, and one application that I showed here was potentially backward control. So recall our starting point then as an ending point for this talk too. Why is covert A movement so rare compared to overt A movement and compared to covert A bar movement? Now, I don't have great answers to this, and I'd be happy to discuss this during the Q&A if anyone's interested, but I have suggested in this talk a way of locating further instances of covert A movement. So one way to wrap this talk up might be to kind of hope that maybe covert A movement is less rare than previously assumed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if I can do the, yes. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Michelle, if I may. Was a very interesting talk, and so I want to thank you again. And now we move to the period of questions. I ask again, I tell again the audience that if they want, they can write the questions in the YouTube chat, and then I'll have them here and pass them on to Michelle or Dr. Yuan. So let's see if there are some questions. None for now, but maybe I can start by asking you a few questions, more like clarification questions about your talk, but which is, I thought it was very interesting because it shows that if there is covert movement, maybe it's related to the fact that the language has this kind of affixal nature, and then this is the only way the sentence could be grammatical in that sense, because it says, you say that some verbs are affixal in nature, right? So this is, I think it was a very interesting analysis. Now, one thing that I was wondering is, but I think you answered this in the talk, but maybe I could just ask again, is the fact that you have, for example, when you have the cases of object shift, you have, for example, in example 21, but also in 2025, for example, in 21A, where you have David wants to eat the cookies, and in 21B, where you have the ergative sentence with the subject in ergative, David wants to eat these cookies. My question was that they have the same form, the sibalar, what the word for biscuit. They have exactly the same form, and but they are translated. They have to be translated different, right? Because one would be probably cookies, but you have the cookies, and the other one is like specific cookies, these cookies, because you said maybe this is related to a further movement of the incorporated object, correct? Now, the only way you can tell the difference in the meaning is because of the presence of the agreement with the object, of the object agreement. So I was wondering if this was another instance to show somehow that the pattern of incorporation does not imply reduction of the object, because even in this case, you don't have a reduced, maybe in form you have a reduced object because you don't have inflection, right? The inflection, the agreement in the object, right? Don't have inflection there, but you can see that it cannot be a non-reduced object because of the meaning, because it's, I mean, if you compare to Romance languages, like you have the definite and the bare nouns and everything, then you see that you cannot have just a common noun there. So maybe they look like bare nouns in Romance, that they are bare because they don't show the thing, but they are not bare, right? Because you have to have some kind of DP there, even if you don't have the D. I'm not sure if this relates to what you were saying.
I think it's actually really related. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that's exactly right. So the idea would be that you can have a nominal that looks morphologically bare, just as what you're saying, but perhaps there might be some other reasons to suggest that it's not actually syntactically reduced, right? So even though there are no, so I guess I should mention that there are no overt determiners in Inuit at all, aside from certain demonstratives, okay? But there's nothing like the, for example. And typically, to sort of know whether you're dealing with a definite or a specific object, it would really just be based on like the case, right? So whether it's or rather, I guess, the construction, like whether you're dealing with an ergative construction or an antipassive one, as I've shown here, where again, a hallmark of the ergative construction is that you have agreement with the object and, you know, things like that. So I think that's exactly it. So the fact that we can actually have agreement with the seemingly bare object would suggest that even though it's morphologically bare, it's syntactically not, right? It would kind of, I think, be equivalent to what you're describing with Romance. And I'll also add here that in some of my other work, which I didn't really touch on in this talk, for Inuktitut specifically, or for Inuktitut and other Eastern Canadian varieties of Inuit specifically, I've actually also argued that the relevant correct analysis of the object agreement actually is more like kind of like Romance style object clitic doubling. So the idea would be that the third person plural agreement that you see in 21b would actually be structurally more similar to a clitic, a pronominal clitic that doubles the, well, in this case, I guess, the incorporated object. So the idea would be that whatever the syntactic properties are of that object, it has to be such that it can be clitic doubled or agreed with and, you know, moved and things like that. And the idea would have to be that these are all kind of obscured by the morphology because of whatever specific requirements there are on the incorporated verb, morphologically speaking.
Yes. So it's crucial for this incorporation. Now incorporation is that the verb requires it, right? Because it's just this amount of small amount of verbs, let's say. And you also said that they all have this light verb feeling, or you assume they are like light verbs, right? Because it is what I mean. You assume that, but I was also thinking about light verbs in, say, languages like Brazilian Portuguese, where the verb has some kind of semantic bleaching, right? I mean, if we have the verb dar, which means to give, just like in English, less the verb to give. But when you have a light verb construction with dar, with give, immediately you don't have the meaning of give anymore. I mean, sometimes you do, but it's really different. For example, and then we can have the noun either being definite noun, but also non-definite or non-specific noun. And so my question is, because I was looking at your examples, and it seems that the meaning of the verb, I mean, I don't know the language, but it means that it seems that the meaning of the verb was not so bleached in the so I don't know whether I was right or not.
I see. Oh, that's a really good question, actually. So I'll say that I would refer you to the work by Johns and also Cook and Johns, where they do discuss kind of the semantic meanings of these kinds of affixal verbs versus the ones that are not so affixal. And I will say you're totally right that perhaps the light verbs in this language are like less bleached than like what you're describing, or even in English, you know, you can say things like take a picture, take a bath, you know, take a nap, or take is kind of really semantically bleached, and it can have all these like literal meanings. So I guess the way that Johns describes these verbs is that they're more bleached than the ones that don't permit incorporation at all, right? So, you know, she was kind of pointing out in her papers that if you kind of think about the kinds of verbs that never incorporate, that is, are not affixal, those would be the ones like, you know, to kiss or to, I don't know, to tickle, to like cook, you know, things that are really like semantically vivid. Whereas the ones that are incorporating are less so, right? So to be, to have, to make, and so on. I mean, I think an example of this would even be sort of the distinction between 9a, consume, versus eat, which I showed in the previous slide here, and 8, you know, can't incorporate. So consume, for example, is a bit more flexible in terms of the kinds of complements it can take. Here we have, you know, a food item, cookie, but consume, for example, is also compatible with liquids, whereas eat isn't. And it's also compatible with like non-food things, like to use things up, right? Or I think to, even like a car using up gas, you can use consume, if I remember correctly, whereas you certainly can't with a lexical verb like eat. So maybe the distinction here is that the light verbs in the language aren't really quite as bleached as found in other languages, but maybe the crucial point here is the contrast between within a single language, the ones that are affixal versus the ones that aren't. Would that make sense as an answer, would you say?
I think so, because light verbs look like they are affixal, you know, way that we cannot really make it precise, because they only have the meaning when they are that precise meaning when they are with some kind of noun. So I don't know, maybe this has to do with it, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was thinking about also, you know, the languages in which like undergative verbs are composed of like a light verb plus like a nominal complement, like in Basque, for example, to say like to do really literally a dance, right? I'm like, I don't think do in Basque is like affixal per se, but I think I kind of see what you mean, where it kind of seems like it's sort of less central than the noun itself in terms of I guess creating the overall meaning of the event. And I don't know if this is, maybe this is true for Inuit as well, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, there was a dissertation here in Brazil that I recently was a member of the committee, and the student, the now doctor, also her idea was that what is crucial for light verb constructions is really the noun, not the verb. So she has this proposal to show this, and maybe this goes well with Inuktitut in a different way.
Yeah. Actually, can I ask you who that is?
It's Daniela Oliveira. I can send you the dissertation, but it's in Portuguese. I mean, but I can give your paper to her, and then maybe you can talk. We'll see.
Okay, that sounds great. And I'll also mention that with regards to Inuktitut as well, you know, you also do get kind of these zero derivation kind of constructions in some cases too, like for certain kinds of nouns that are a bit more like commonly, I guess, kind of culturally common. So if you want to say that you're like going sealing, like to hunt for seals, I mean, you can have the noun seal plus no overt verbal morphology, and then seal just kind of looks like as though it's been it's attaching to like tense and other kinds of morphology. So it kind of looks as though there are also like maybe like a zero sort of verbalizing light verb too in the language. It would probably fall into this category too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the morphology people should look at Inuktitut as well. It's really nice.
Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning the dissertation. I'll definitely check it out. And I'm kind of curious about this idea myself now. So
yes, she works with two verbs in Brazilian Portuguese, which is dar, do, give, and fazer, which is do. And well, I'll show you I'll send you the dissertation.
Okay.
And I'll make you in contact with her. So let's put you in contact with her. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions, because I'm taking no questions yet. But I mean, if somebody wants to ask a question related to what we are discussing here, just don't be shy. Go ahead and write it up, and I'll pass this to Michelle. So let me see. I also think I have another thing here. The thing about, because you say that incorporated nouns, they participate in syntactic phenomena like file agreement, and this leads to your prediction that there is a possibility of syntactic movement in incorporation in Inuktitut.
Yes.
But then you say that it's post-syntactic, derived by merger between the verb and its nominal complement, right? And then the upper cough is erased because of this stray affix filter. So, but it's, I think, as you said, it's an unusual pattern for noun incorporation. So I was thinking if there's any other phenomena or evidence in the language that would back up your proposal for this A movement being post-syntactic or in other languages.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the way that I would answer this is that perhaps when we talk about incorporation as a phenomenon, maybe, you know, what we could do in the future is also kind of differentiate between different kinds of incorporation, right? Because like I mentioned earlier in this talk that the kind of distinctive feature of incorporation in Inuit is that it is obligatory for certain verbs and otherwise not possible, and that is different from incorporation as it's more commonly seen in other languages, where it's actually kind of optional with various kinds of you know, various kinds of verbs, for example. So it kind of seems as though maybe like we're really dealing with two different phenomena which do get labeled as incorporation because of the kind of the surface appearance of these constructions. But so in addition to Inuit, actually, there are other languages, all kind of very morphologically complex as well, that have been shown to have this kind of obligatory sort of nature for certain verbs and not possible for other verbs either. So one language would actually be Nuu-chah-nulth, which is spoken, it's a Wakashan language spoken in like British Columbia. And there's this dissertation by Rachel Woydock, I believe her name is, and she has a book as well from like, I forget what year it is, 2010 possibly, where she kind of shows that actually it seems very similar in the language and that there are certain kinds of things that verbal things that seem affixal, which obligatorily incorporate. And she actually also shows that, you know, these kinds of constructions are compatible with like passive morphology as well on the verb, although she doesn't show if there's like movement or not. But, you know, I guess the point here is that it maybe seems as though it's a hallmark of these kinds of languages that have obligatory incorporation, because there are certain kinds of like verbal things that are affixal, and that is maybe a distinct kind of phenomenon from the other kind of incorporation. Yes. So yeah, so there's that. The other thing I'll mention is that while this talk focuses on a movement in Inuktitut, in my other work, so for example, in my dissertation, I also discuss how the same kinds of patterns show up in A-bar contexts as well. So for example, in relative clauses, you can also kind of incorporate the embedded verb and have the lower, you basically have what looks like an internally headed relative clause, even though it acts like it's not internally headed. So that would kind of follow from the same logic as shown here too. So it really seems as though throughout the language that this kind of, I guess, incorporating requirement can yield the same kind of effect in all these different areas. Yeah.
Yes, that was one of my questions, my curiosity about the language, which is what would happen with a bar movement. But then this is interesting as well. So it shows a pattern. So it's probably related to the morphological complexity of the language.
Yeah, right? I think so. Yeah. So I'll say in the 8-bar domain, so you can also get WH words being incorporated, but it's not really obvious to begin with if the language actually has like, you know, movement of WH phrases as opposed to genuine in C2, and that I don't think has really been figured out by anybody super concretely. So that's sort of less clear, but I think the relative clause stuff is really interesting because you can really see that even though the I guess the head of the relative clause ends up being incorporated inside the embedded clause, that it doesn't really behave as though it's been it doesn't behave as though it's really in C2. Yeah, and sometimes you can even get multiple copy spell out. If, for example, the matrix verb and the embedded verb are both incorporating, you actually get 2 instances of the head of the relative clause too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, well, I think this brings a lot of contributions to the study of syntactic movement and the various ways that you can have, even the deletion of copies, because, for example, when for this theory of copy movement or movement, and then copies arose or arrived or began to be proposed in this field, the idea was the upper copy would stay and the lower copy would be deleted. Mm-hmm. But then a lot of languages show that this is not always the case, because sometimes the lower copy had to stay because not be deleted, and the upper copy would be deleted because of things like focus, or because they were not really copies, exactly the same copies. That's why. Mm-hmm. And so I think that your paper, your work shows that, well, now we have another instance of a lower copy having to be there, not being deleted, and it's nice. That's wonderful. Okay, I think this is this is interesting. We have to think about this and see what the extensions of this proposal could be for other phenomena in other languages. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a question now. So how different from Buio, Brazil, I don't know who this person is, how different are other First Nation languages regarding a movement?
Oh, interesting question. So I will say that I think it kind of depends on the exact language families in question. Oh, so I'll first mention that actually Inuit's not a First Nations language. So in Canada, there's the First Nations, there's also the Métis, and then there's the Inuit. So the Inuit are not First Nations in Canada. But I think crucially, even setting that aside, there are so many different language families within, Canada, and also within North America in general, in terms of the kinds of indigenous languages that are spoken there, that it's difficult to really ascertain. But I will say that kind of looking beyond Inuit to other languages that are also morphologically complex, I think some of my work was, and now I'm realizing I didn't cite this person, but some of my work is actually really inspired by work by Ben Bruning on Passamaquoddy, which is an Algonquian language, also morphologically complex, where he actually shows that there's a lot of really interesting A-type phenomena in that language too. So I would invite, thank you for asking the question, whoever you are, I didn't catch the name, but you can definitely check out the work by Ben Bruning on A phenomena in Passamaquoddy as an example.
Passamaquoddy, okay, great. Okay, let's see. Don't see any other questions here. We still have some time if you want to say something else about your work. I'm out of. I think we are okay.
Okay. Not too much. I guess something that you and I talked about really briefly before the talk started was sort of the question as to why covert A movement is so uncommon, because like the point of this talk was to kind of show that there's a way to look for more cases of it, but it still seems like overall it's a lot rarer than covert A bar movement or, overt A movement, of course, as well. So I think that question really still lingers. And perhaps it's not sufficient. What I did at the end of the talk was to simply say, well, maybe there's more cases if we just kind of look harder. But I think that potentially there could be a few different reasons for why A movement tends to be overt, seemingly based on the existing data that we have thus far, which, I think that in a lot of cases of covert A bar movement, especially the kind that seems to be interacting with morphology in some ways, it oftentimes has to do with some property of C right? So like the cases of Coptic that I mentioned earlier, it had to do with C being overt and some sort of interaction with C and whatever inspects CP. There's some work by Landau on verb doubling, which he argues is also generated by a bar movement of a VP in this case, where you get multiple spell because of certain kinds of interactions as well between C and the topmost copy, and then between T and the lower copy. And I kind of wonder whether the reason why overt A movement is so much more common than covert A movement is maybe having to do with like the shortness of the movement, because you don't really end up with these two different kinds of interactions between the topmost and the bottommost chain the way that you could have in a bar movement. But I'm not sure if that actually would make sense if I think about it a little bit further, but I guess that's something that I'm kind of thinking about at least, and kind of putting out there as a thing that people should maybe think about a bit more. So like, why is it that covert A movement is so rare? If A movement and if A bar movement are generated by the exact same kind of process that leads there to be this possibility of covert movement.
Yeah, but certainly related by the morphologically complexity of the language involved, because I mean, we have to look at all the other languages and to see how a movement proceeds, right? Because we are used to, you know, Western, I mean, Romance and European languages and English and all, but maybe there's more there to it.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think part of that is that I think from like a generative perspective, there isn't too much work comparatively on languages that are very morphologically complex, you know, like Inuit and also other languages too. And perhaps it's just a bit harder to look for cases of movement to begin with, because languages are, you know, pretty morphologically complex, because they do tend to have freer word order, you know, things like that. There's a lot of argument drop as well, so sometimes you can't really see where the arguments are. So it's also possible that if we do kind of look a little more at these languages that also tend to be understudied to begin with, you know, maybe like the way that we view these kinds of phenomena could change as well.
That's true. Yes, I agree with that. Okay, so I don't think there are any other questions. So I would like to once again thank you for having accepted our invitation and for this great talk. And I would like to thank the audience as well. And we hope to meet in person in the near future.
I hope so.
Hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, well, not that the ABRALIN online linguistics online is very nice. I think it has to go on forever, but I mean, it's nice to have the in-person conversation as well.
I agree. Yeah. Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I just want to really quickly thank you as well for moderating, for the great discussion, and thank you to ABRALIN as well for the invitation and to have put together this whole series to begin with. I've watched quite a few of the videos myself, especially in 2020, so it was cool to be here as well. Thank you very much. That was cool. Okay, so thank you once more, and we hope to see you all in the next ABRALIN ao vivo. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.